Now, because this is a history class, we are gonna need to give you a timeline of events of what happened. No. So let me walk you through the events of the time. Now, yung pinaka-critical na event which led to the reformation of the Philippines or policy reforms was the British invasion of the Philippines from 1762 to 1764. So, part to ng Seven Years' War sa Europe, which we don't really need to know much about. Basta yung point ay may gulo in Europe between powers that involved Spain and Britain. And this led to the British invasion here. Now, they were, of course, not necessarily kicked out, pero nag-end na kasi yung war nila. Tapos nag-withdraw yung British Navy from Manila. But the events following that showed Philippine administrators na they needed to change the way the Philippines was managed. So one of the major changes would begin in the 1770s with the Basco y Vargas reforms. You'll meet Basco y Vargas later, but he was a governor general in the Philippines and siya yung unang nag-push talaga na mag-iba yung economic system of the Philippines. So, dahan-dahang nag-shift yung Philippines to a cash crop agriculture system or a high-value crop agriculture system from this point onwards. Now, generally, in the 19th century, so the 19th century is from 1800 hanggang 1899. So, when we say the 19th century, it's actually the dates between that. So, 18 something dapat yung 19th century. I know it can be kind of confusing, no? Pero when we talk about kunyari 1900 to 1901 to 1999, yun ay 20th century na. So like move it a century backwards from 1800 to 1899, that would be the 19th century. So within that period, makikita natin globally that there is an increasing dominance of the global import and export of resources under trading empires like the British Empire. So, if you've ever watched any movies or series from that period of time, diba? When there were large British ships. So if you're interested in the history of pirates, like the Pirates of the Caribbean, yung history nila medyo nag-coincide with this. So all around the world, you would have these new trading empires. And what they would do is they would collect raw materials from their colonies. For example, Great Britain's colonies were India. They also had a lot of colonies in what will now be the United States. They would collect these items, they would process them, and then they would export them as finished products, usually to Western countries. Now, in the Philippines, dahan-dahan pa tayong nag-shift to that system as well. Nauna kasi talaga yung parang at the time, hindi na dominant power yung Spain. And so it was kind of having to catch up to these new systems of economy. Now, changes in the Philippines soon reflect this global trend. When you are processing agricultural goods into finished products, what is necessary for that system, for that process? No? On the raw material side, syempre, you need to be able to plant and harvest those raw materials, whether it's cotton or tobacco or sugar, diba? So, in the Philippines, more land is converted into haciendas for cultivation. Mestizos and richer Indios are now able to increase their wealth through these haciendas, whether by owning the haciendas or by managing the haciendas. And the mass population, so that's people who are not necessarily wealthy, migrates to places where farm work is available. So there is a mass migration of Philippine natives from areas with low agricultural productivity to places with high agricultural productivity, as well as migration to city centers where more jobs can be found. So we'll see that later. Basically, here I'm trying to portray how the Philippines started to shift to this new system along with global trends. Now, what else happens that's important for the Philippine economy in particular? Now, from the 1810s to 1815, 1821, the Mexican Revolution commences, and Spain and the Spanish lose a vital component of the galleon trade. Now, remember, what are the two things that are most important in the galleon trade system? SS, silver and silk. Silver from the Spanish side that they were acquiring from the Americas, and silk and porcelain and other items that would come from China. Now, without silver, the galleon trade could not continue in the same way it had continued as before. So, the loss of Acapulco silver, kasi naging independent na nga yung Mexico, would mean the Philippines needs a new system of economy. So not only are there global trends leading to a more profitable system of economy as demonstrated by the British Empire, you also have a blow to the way the Philippine economy is shaped. So the last galleon, in fact, set sail from the Philippines in 1815. Yun na yung end ng galleon trade. Pero of course, alam natin na as early as the 1770s, sinisimulan na nilang i-shift yung economy na ng Pilipinas. Pero syempre, madami pang backlash yun eh. Kaya ito yung sinasabi kong soft turning point. Gradual siyang nangyayari. Na, excuse me, na-cement lang siya nung panahon ng Mexican Revolution. Pero all of these kind of dates are important to understanding how the Philippines eventually ended up with a cash crop agriculture. Now, another important set of dates, or another important turning point is between 1869 to the 1870s. Lahat to ay 19th century, remember? So, remember how the 19th century looks in actual dates. So, anyway, coming back to this turning point, a liberal Governor General, Carlos Maria de la Torre, is sent to the Philippines, and Mestizo and Indio middle classes are able to push for secularization and liberal reforms under his leadership. Now I know you're probably thinking, wait lang, I haven't learned what secularization and liberal reforms actually are. And that's okay, kasi we're only looking at the timeline here. I'll define what those are in the following slides. Basta remember na importante to kasi na empower yung Mestizo and Indio middle classes to push for reforms where they would be better represented, or they would have more rights under the Spanish Empire. Now, the final turning point really for this period in time is in 1872. Because in 1872, we find a very important event. And that is the Padres Jose Burgos, Mariano Gomez, and Jacinto Zamora, your Gumburza, are executed wrongfully for the Cavite Mutiny. And this adds fuel to the push for reforms under the propaganda movement. So, kumbaga, di ba, in Spain, nagkakaproblema between these two factions. Because of the turnovers in power, nagkaroon ng isang liberal governor-general in the Philippines na pinadala dito. And yung reforms na pinush niya were quite helpful for the Mestizo and Indio middle classes who previously were seen as racially inferior to the Spanish who were pure-blooded. So sila, dahil sa bagong sistema ng ekonomiya sa Pilipinas, ay ngayon mas mayaman na, mas edukado na, and they were pushing for more political representation here. So nag-coincide yun na empower sila. And then, there's another change in leadership which we'll see later. Tapos, nagkaroon ng isang mutiny at yung in-execute nila for that mutiny were 3 padres who were actually part of this middle class who were pushing for reforms. So kumbaga, parang nagsisnowball na yung idea that because of these reforms, Filipinos are starting to realize that you could actually run the Philippines from a perspective where your mestizos and your Indios, the people who would be later called Filipino, had more power than the Spanish. So parang yun yung direction of of developments. So later, this will birth the propaganda movement, which you might have heard of already before. Ito yung movement na headed by the Philippine Ilustrados, who would push for reforms under Spain for full protection and acknowledgement of Filipinos as citizens of Spain. But we're going to cover that in Module 6. So overall, we had a shift in economy, and then we eventually had a shift in the way people wanted to be governed as well. Okay, that's it for our turning points. I hope they were kind of clear to you. We begin with the invasion of the Philippines, that question of security, and we end with another question, which is who should be able to influence the way the Philippines is managed at the end of the day? Should it mostly be the Spanish, or should it be Filipinos who are an emerging identity? Okay. So that's it for the first segment. In the next segment, we're going to talk about global contexts and how they would set the stage for reforms in the Philippines. I'll see you there.